You stand in the shadow of the majestic cathedral on the cool morning of medieval England. On the calendar 1236 years, and the sun's rays break through the stained glass, scattering rainbow patterns on the cold stone floor. The air is densely impregnated with incense and quiet prayers of the nobility, gathered here on the day, which was supposed to become the most joyful in the life of a young woman. But if you look closely at the bride of the altar, you will notice what makes the blood shake in the veins. Her hands are trembling not from excitement, but from pure horror. This is Ilinan Province. She is only 13 years old. Next to her stands Henry III, the King of England, 20-8 years old, and for her a completely alien person. Until today, they never spoke to each other. She never saw his face until he lifted her veil. Her childhood ended at the very moment when her father signed a marriage contract. And now she is standing here, knowing that in a few hours something more terrible awaits her than any battle or plague. Her wedding night. This is not an edited fairy tale from Disney films or romantic historical dramas. This is a cruel reality of medieval royal marriages, where 13-year-old girls sold, like cattle, to men who could be their fathers. Where the most intimate moments of a woman's life turned into public performances. Where wedding nights were not the holidays of love, but the traumatic rituals of initiation that could kill. Welcome to the real story of why the medieval queens were afraid of their wedding nights than death. These are not just stories about nervous brides that have changed their minds. These are stories about systematic horror, about children abandoned in an adult life that they could not understand, about young women who knew that their wedding night could become the last night when they had ever felt safe. Before we plunge into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you are interested in finding out the hidden aspects of history, like and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to write in the comments where you are listening from. It is amazing me that we are exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected through the time and space of our common curiosity to the past. The first thing to understand about medieval royal marriages is that with love they had nothing to do. These were not romantic alliances between people who chose each other. These were business transactions, political alliances and marriage agreements, where the feelings of the bride were not only ignored, but could be dangerous for her family. Imagine this reality. You are a noble daughter, you are 10 or 11, you play with dolls or learn to embroider when your father calls you to your chambers. He does not ask your opinion and does not seek your consent. He simply reports that you were promised a man whom you have never seen in a country that you have never visited, for reasons that you are too young to understand. Your childhood has officially ended, and nothing can be changed. Margaret Bowett learned this lesson at the age of 6 when she was engaged to John Deol, the son of the Duke of Suffolk. By the time she was 9, the political situation had changed, and Edmund promised her there instead of the previous groom. She did not have the right to vote in any of these marriages. Its value was not measured by intelligence, kindness or dreams of the future. Its value was estimated by the land that she will inherit, according to the unions that her marriage can strengthen, and most importantly, for children whom she can give birth. The psychological influence of this system cannot be overestimated. These girls grew up with the realization that their bodies did not belong to them, that their future was decided by men in distant castles, and that one day they would be given to a completely alien person who would receive absolute power over their lives. They lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when the order comes, and what kind of person they will have to take as husbands. But the marriage was only the beginning of the nightmare. Real horror began with the so-called bed ceremony. The medieval tradition is so invading and traumatic that by modern standards it could be considered torture. This was not a private moment for the newlyweds. It was a public site where the most intimate act of marriage turned into entertainment for society. This is how it happened. After the wedding feast, the bride and groom accompanied the crowd of guests to the bedroom. Relatives, friends, and sometimes completely outsiders nobility into the room, jokingly rudely and distributing uninvited advice, while the frightened couple was forced to undress in front of everyone. The guests threw clothes around the room, made sharp comments about the bride's body and created an atmosphere of a sexual circus, turning what should have been a personal moment into a humiliating public representation. For the royal pairs, the bed ceremony was even more invading. Since these marriages were political unions, which cost conditions and entire kingdoms, there were witnesses to make sure that the marriage was properly committed. In some cases, the guests remained in the room during the act itself, watching because of the curtains or standing at the wear of the bed to confirm that the case was done. Virginity of the bride, her pain, fear, tears, everything became public property. Imagine that you are 13, You are already scared by a stranger that you were forced to marry, and then dozens of adults are watching how you are stripped and prepared for what you know. It will be painful and scary. The psychological trauma from this ritual in itself was destructive for these young girls, but was considered the norm, even a necessity to confirm the legality of royal marriage. Witnesses were not out of anger there, although the effect was certainly cruel. They were there because virgin brides were considered political assets, and their test had to be confirmed in order to avoid future disputes about the inheritance or legality of offspring. If the queen could not give birth to the heir or there were doubts about the paternity of the child, the witnesses of the bed could testify that the marriage was properly completed. The bride's injury was simply side damage in the system, which put political stability above human dignity. But perhaps the most terrible aspect of the medieval royal wedding nights was not a public shame and not forced intimacy with strangers. The most terrible was the youth of the brides themselves. These were not adult women who make conscious decisions about their sexuality. These were children, some of only 8 or 9 years old, who were faced with situations of adulthood, which they could not understand or to which they could not give consent. The youngest queen in English history, Isabella Debauched, marrying King Richard II at only 8 years. 8 years. Try to imagine an 8-year-old girl today, who has said that she will marry an adult man and will share the bed with him. The idea itself would seem monstrous. But for the medieval nobility, this was a common practice. Eleanor Provence married Henry III at the age of 13. Margaret Anange was 15 when it was combined with a marriage with Henry V, as well as Anna Bohemian, when became the first wife of Richard II. These were no exception. It was the norm. The political value of these girls was so high that families could not allow themselves to wait until they were emotionally or physically ready for marriage. Medical reality makes it even more terrible. In the Middle Ages, the girls usually reached menarche at about 16 years old, and not at 12 or 30, as they often believe today. This means that many of these young brides had to marry and give birth to the heirs even before their bodies were ready for pregnancy. But this did not stop their husbands, who tried to achieve their, often with destructive consequences. The case of Margaret Bowett brightly shows the horror who was waiting for these young queens. At 12 years, she was married to Edmund there, a man older than her 20-4 years older. It was believed that young brides should wait for physical maturity before their marriages are completed intimately. But Edmund could not wait. He needed access to Margaret's inheritance, he needed an heir to fix his rights to her land. What happened next can only be described as systematic violence. An adult man repeatedly attacked a 12-year-old wife until she became pregnant. Margaret's own notes made later in life reveal all the horror of this experience: sleepless nights, constant fear and helpless rage of a child, who finds himself in an alien world of adults. When Edmund died from the plague less than a year, he left behind a 13-year-old widow, pregnant with his child. Margaret herself was still a child when the birth began, and the process almost killed it. Her confessor later described this as a miracle that such a little girl was able to give birth at all. The injury from these clans was so strong that, despite the 2 subsequent marriages, Margaret no longer had children. Her body was irreversibly damaged by pregnancy, for which it was not ready. Margaret's experience was not unique. It was a predictable result of a system that considered young girls as tribal material, and not as people. These young queens entered into marriage, knowing that they could be subjected to violence, that they could be forced to give birth before their body was ready, and that they could die in the process. Their fears were not irrational anxiety. These were realistic assessments of the dangers that awaited them. But physical trauma is only a part of horror. The psychological impact of such marriages created a whole generation of queens who lived in constant fear. They never knew when a husband could become cruel. Never had anyone who could be trusted or who could turn to for help. They were isolated in foreign courtyards, surrounded by strangers who saw in them political assets, not people. The system was created to break these girls, to turn them from independent children into humble wives who will give birth to heirs without questions and complaints. The wedding night was just the beginning of life, full of systematic suppression, which deprived their personality, autonomy and often will to life. Pliving deeper into these forgotten stories, we understand that the fears of the medieval queens touched more than one night of horror. They understood that the wedding night is the beginning of life, where they will never control their bodies, their decisions or their fate again. True horror was not only what was happening in the bedroom. He continued on. When the morning came after the first traumatic night, these young queens discovered that their nightmare was far from the end. The wedding night was not a one-time act of horror. It was an opening act of a whole drama of life, where every new morning brought new reasons to be afraid of what was waiting ahead. Imagine the morning ritual of a 13-year-old queen, who has just experienced its first sexual test in front of the public. She woke up wounded, bleeding, and psychologically destroyed, only in order to be examined by court doctors who had to make sure that she was no longer a virgin. Her bedding was checked for traces of blood. Her body was touched and examined by outsiders, and the most intimate details of her injuries were recorded in official documents for descendants. But this physical examination was only the beginning of the observation system, which controlled each aspect of its reproductive life. The medieval queens were not just wives. They were walking uterus, whose main value was the ability to give birth to male heirs. Every month, court officials tracked their menstrual cycles. Each meal was controlled for signs of pregnancy. Every moment of personal life invaded the observation of servants, whose work consisted in reports on the queen's fertility. The pressure to get pregnant right away was unbearable. The queen, who could not conceive a child in the first year of marriage, came across a whisper of accusations of witchcraft, divine punishment, or worse, in treason. The political unions that justified her traumatic wedding night depended on her ability to provide the heir, and failure meant not only personal humiliation, but also potential divorce, exile, or death. Margaret, who married Henry V at the age of 15, survived 8 years of marriage before finally gave birth to the heir. 8 years of monthly disappointment, examinations of court doctors, whispers about whether it is not damaged or faulty. When she finally gave birth to Edward from Worcestershire, the relief was so strong that she, according to rumors, cried for hours, not from joy, but from the realization that she finally fulfilled the purpose for which she was sold. The medical reality of medieval pregnancy made these fears even more justified. Without modern medical knowledge and sanitation, childbirth was actually a deadly sentence that only a few managed to survive. The mortality of women during childbirth was amazingly high, and court doctors often cared more about the preservation of the child than their mother. The queen's life was valuable as much as she could produce heirs. As soon as this function was performed, its survival became secondary compared to the child. Eleanor Provence, who trembled at the wedding altar, gave birth to her first child at 16 years old. The birth lasted 3 days, and she almost died of blood loss. But a few months later she was again pregnant, because the political need to have several heirs outweighed any concerns about her physical restoration. As a result, she gave birth to 5 children, and every birth was a potential fatal test, which she accepted with that persistent humility, which is inherent in a person who understands that his life never really belonged to himself. The psychological price of this reproductive service cannot be reassessed. These young queens lived in constant fear of pregnancy, knowing that every new attachment can be the last for them. They developed complex superstitions around the fertility, prayed to the saints for protection, wore amulets to prevent a miscarriage, and obeyed strange medical procedures, which more often caused more harm than good. Some queens tried to take control of their reproductive life using primitive forms of contraception or preventing pregnancy. But such attempts were considered state treason. The queen, who deliberately prevented pregnancy, actually went against the crown and political unions, which depended on her fertility. Punishments for such actions were ranging from prison to execution, depending on the political situation and the character of the king. But perhaps the most depressing aspect of their position was the complete isolation in which they were. These young queens usually went to other people's yards, where they did not know anyone, spoke other languages, and had neither allies nor defenders. They were cut off from their families, friends of childhood, and everyone who could provide emotional support in the process of traumatic transition to a married life. Even the language barrier created new levels of fear. Imagine that you are 13, you are already injured by your wedding night, and suddenly you understand that you cannot communicate with anyone. You cannot express your fears, ask for help, and even understand what they expect from you. The servants spoke someone else's language, the customs were alien, and the person who now controlled your life was virtually a stranger, as if from another planet. Isabella de Valva, the 8-year-old queen, was sent from France to England without any childhood friends. She was surrounded by English courtiers, who considered it as a political miracle, and not as a frightened child. When she tried to preserve French customs or speak her native language, she was scolded and forced to adapt to the English orders. Her personality, culture, self-awareness were systematically selected and replaced by the fact that the English courtyard considered suitable for his queen. The preserved correspondence of these medieval queens reveals the depths of their despair. They wrote about such a longing for the house that she caused physical pain, about the nightmares, because of which they were afraid to sleep, about a constant sense of observation and condemnation from people who did not give a damn about their well-being. Their letters home are full of encoded requests for help, desperate requests to see familiar faces, and barely hidden expressions of regrets about marriages that destroyed their lives. As they grow older, many of these young queens developed what we would recognize today's serious mental disorders. They became closed, paranoid, and deeply suspicious to everyone around. Some went into religious extremism, spent a clock in prayers, or went into dangerous pilgrimages as a form of psychological escape. Others became powerful and manipulative, using any small power that they managed to preserve in order to complicate the life of their tormentors. The most tragic were the cases of queens who simply gave up completely. The court records are described by the queens who stopped eating, refusing to speak, sat motionless for hours, staring at the void. These were not dramatic gestures or a desire for attention. These were psychological breakdowns of young women who survived more injuries than their mind could endure. The fears of the medieval queens before the wedding night touched more than one night of horror. They understood that this night meant the beginning of life in which they would never again control their bodies, their decisions, or their fate. They were afraid of a wedding night, because they intuitively understood, everything that makes them people, everything that makes them personalities will be systematically destroyed for the sake of political unions, in the creation of which they did not participate. These forgotten queens entered into wedding nights with the courage of soldiers going to the battle, knowing that they could not survive this experience, and that even if they survive, they will never be those people who walk through the aisle to the altar. Their fears were not the nervous excitement of modern brides, but by the rational horror of children who understood that they were going to sacrifice political necessity to the altar. The next time you see a medieval wedding in films or on television, remember Eleanor Provenza, trembling at the altar. Remember the traumatic birth of Margaret Beaufort. Remember Isabella Duval, crying in a mother in a language that no one around him understood. Remember that behind each crown was a frightened child sold by the system, which appreciated him only because his body could give. These queens deserve to be remembered not only as political figures or historical notes, but as people who have experienced unimaginable injuries with the power of the spirit, which should inspire us all. Their fears of the wedding night were fully justified. And their courage in the face of these fears reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of human history, the human spirit finds ways to survive.